Welcome to Friday's edition of the Daily Report for January 28th. I'm Min San Hee. The gist of Korea's COVID-19 strategy amid Omicron is rapid and extensive testing, as well as effective monitoring of severe cases. We start now with the global pandemic tallies with our Kwon So-ah. So Korea has noted yet another high today.
Yes, Sunny. And for the third straight day, Korea is posting more than 10,000 new COVID-19 infections. 16,096 is the figure we're looking at here today as of 12 a.m. And that includes 15,894 domestic transmissions and 202 imported cases. This figure, however, declined slightly from the day before. Now, accounting for around 65% of the nation's cases, the capital region here has, for the first time, surpassed 10,000 infections. And also, Gyeonggi province, even more than 5,000, Seoul, close to 4,000. There were also some milestones made in some places. We've got the city of Daegu now with over 30,000 cases in total, and Gyeongsangbuk-gu province with more than 20,000 cases in total as of this Friday. And if we move over to our graph, we are seeing this graph here going slightly up every day. And also compared to last Friday, it is a jump by more than 9,000 infections. Now moving over to the total caseload here, more than 793,500 cases, and the death toll standing at 6,678 with 24 additional fatalities reported in the past day. And the number of patients in severe or critical condition, however, has been on the decline lately and now stands at 316 for the fourth straight day in the 300s. Vaccination figures are continuously going up, but not that much when it comes to the first shot, which still stands at 86.9% and 85.6% for those that are considered fully vaccinated. And now we've got 51.4% or more than 26.3 million people in the nation who received that additional booster shot. And let's go over to the figures abroad. Some 3.6 million new infections were posted globally in the past day, with more than 10,700 new deaths. And the U.S. has reported around 500,000 new cases, and India around 250,000 new infections, and many places in Europe still see six-digit figures. However, the UK is now seeing a slight drop with around 90,000 new infections. And those are the general updates I have for now, but I'll see you back in a bit. Sunny?
All right, so thank you for those tallies. And while we wait for you to get seated for more talks, our Shin Yeon is going to start us off with more local coverage as Korea, like mentioned earlier, logs yet another record high in daily infections. Right, Yeon?
That's right, Sunny. Our daily figures has risen more quickly than authorities had forecast, mainly due to the spread of the Omicron variant. But the Prime Minister said the situation remains under control.
Maybe because people perceive Omicron to be less fatal, or thanks to our well-prepared Omicron strategy, we've all been handling the surge in new infections quite well. We've managed to raise booster shot rates among seniors, secured enough hospital beds, constantly enhanced equipment for at-home treatment, and expedited the use of antiviral pills.
During a special briefing held Thursday, KDCA Commissioner Chung Eun-kyung also said though the Omicron variant is quite concerning, it's not to an extent that it threatens medical capacity.
After analyzing the regions in Korea hit hardest by Omicron, we realized that the number of infections increased exponentially, but the number of those in critical condition was actually lower than the average tally in the country. We've seen the number of critically ill come down and have restored stability in our medical capacity with enough hospital beds available.
Right, and that, of course, is great to know. Now, Yeon, what else was addressed during this special session?
Right, so experts who took part in Thursday's briefing said Omicron isn't as fatal compared to other variants. It's actually comparable to the seasonal flu, but with symptoms that are slightly more severe. Citing a study from the UK, experts said most Omicron patients experience mild symptoms like coughing, runny nose, headache, fatigue, and sore throat. While Omicron may not often lead to serious illnesses, it can still weigh heavily on our medical capacity, given that it's twice as transmissible as the Delta variant. There were also questions in regards to whether our current testing test kits were effective enough, especially since 4.5% of our imported Omicron cases were stealth Omicron infections, as they're being called. As the moniker suggests, stealth Omicron is a subvariant known as BA2 that is more difficult to identify with PCR tests. But Commissioner Chung reassured the public that Korea's homegrown PCR test kits have been able to detect this strain. She added that we shouldn't be too concerned about this subvariant yet, but it will continue to be monitored. As to how Korea will tackle the spread of Omicron, the head of the KDCA cited the importance of efficiently utilizing our limited medical resources.
We are expanding the number of hospitals and clinics that are able to monitor patients being treated at home. We're also planning to bring in some 31,000 courses of antiviral pills at clinics by the end of January. They're currently being used on those with weak immunity and seniors over 60 to prevent them from developing severe illnesses.
Right. And meanwhile, Yeon, do remind us about the schedule for the nationwide switch, that is, to rapid antigen testings.
Right, so rapid antigen tests will be available from this Saturday at testing sites across the nation, and they will have to be used by most of the population from February 3rd. Excluding people over 60, those at high risk, or those who came to close contact with an infected person, everyone else will have to test themselves with a rapid antigen kit at screening centers or local clinics starting once again at February 3rd.
Right, February 3rd, meaning that Thursday then next week. Right, and speaking of local clinics, so I believe they are poised to share the burden of medical workload, that is, in treating COVID-19 patients from now on.
Right, Sunny, the government announced this Friday that starting on February 3rd, so that would be right after the Lunar New Year holidays, people can not only get tested for COVID-19 at their local hospitals, but they can also get treated and receive home recovery service if needed at these local hospitals. So that meaning patients with a suspected infection who went to a clinic for a rapid antigen test, if they're not one of the groups prioritized for PCR tests, and then have tested positive, will then undergo a PCR test at that hospital. If they are positive, they can be prescribed with oral treatment pills, namely Pfizer's Paxlovid. The clinic will also expand their management of that patient for their home recovery monitoring service. The government says 431 hospitals and clinics that specialize in respiratory diseases are designated so far to kickstart this 3-in-1 system. And then the number of such and other local clinics will gradually be expanded to roughly 1,000, with the government currently taking requests from hospitals nationwide. Authorities also tried to alleviate concerns over possible transmissions at those medical centers and disruptions in the treatment of non-COVID patients.
To prevent infections at hospitals and clinics, strict bookings will be enforced for all visits. Social distancing will be maintained, and KF94 masks will need to be worn. Waiting rooms will be kept separate, and some medical centers will divide their treatment schedules into morning and night shifts.
Right, now, so another source of much concern as we brace against Omicron is our testing capacity. Having said that, where do we stand on that front?
Right, Sunny, we're dealing with over 10,000 cases a day now, and inevitably we will need more PCR tests as well as rapid antigen tests. And so far, the government has been stressing that there's more supply than demand. But the question is, until when? Now, already some people are finding it difficult to find self-test kits at pharmacies, that is, with concerns about a supply shortage, similar to that at the beginning of the pandemic when we are running out of masks. Now, this Friday, officials said around 3 million rapid antigen tests are stocked, with supply much higher than demand. Now, Korea can manufacture some 7.5 million rapid antigen tests on a day that can be used as self-test kits, along with 8.5 million for use by medical professionals. That meaning around 20-fold more than PCR tests. In case of PCR tests, the maximum production capacity is 800,000 a day. To prevent shortage-related issues, officials said today that the Drug Ministry held discussions and made agreements with self-test kit producers on Thursday, including on a stable price for the products.
Right, and moving forward, as we usher in the long weekend into the Lunar New Year, so our officials have renewed calls for caution, of course.
Yes, they have. Health Minister Kwon Dok-chol asked at the earlier briefing, asked the nation's people to try to travel as little as possible over the 5-day span. And Prime Minister Kim Boo-kyum also called on the public sector to be an example to the nation's people by trying to refrain from visiting their hometowns throughout this year's lunar holiday.
Right, and despite the government asking the nation's people to avoid non-essential travel, some 28.7 million people are expected to be on the move from this Friday all the way until February 2nd. The Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport is forecasting an average of 4.8 million travelers each day over the long weekend. And this is an increase of 17% from last year's Lunar New Year. And many people are expected to visit Jeju Island in particular. Compared to last year, the number of hotel and flight bookings to Jeju jumped by 35%. And more than 207,000 people are expected to visit the resort island during the holiday. And as Swa mentioned, the government is asking people to stay at home if possible. But for those who must travel, they're being asked to get their booster shots and tested for COVID-19 ahead of time. And also people are being advised to make their visits short, avoid using public transportation and rest areas along the road, and wear masks that are certified to be KF80 or higher.
Right. One final question. So authorities, I understand, are reportedly not looking to adjust their COVID-19 prevention guidelines for now, right?
Right. When it comes to social distancing, as despite forecasts that cases could rise to even above 30,000 after the Lunar Year holidays, the government is expected to focus its management of the situation by the means of the shifts in testing and treatment rather than strengthening social distancing measures again. Now, Son Young-nae, a health ministry official, told reporters on Thursday that the government is trying not to raise its social distancing level if possible, as it leads to too many disruptions in society and the economy, adding that the Omicron situation is not one where social distancing rules get stricter the higher the daily infection numbers are. It is about focusing on keeping the number of patients in severe and critical condition and fatalities stable. In regards to what could change, according to an official at the presidential of Cheongwade, is a change in the reporting of cases, which would distinguish between the critically ill and deaths, for instance, in different age groups. Now, up until the 6th of February, private gatherings are limited to 6 people, and restaurants and cafes have to close at 9 p.m. So it looks like that the additional social distancing measures will not be stricter than that, according to the forecast by these officials, but we will have to wait and see whether these current measures will be extended or not.
I see. All right, so thank you. See you on Thursday after the Lunar New Year holiday. And Yeon, do have a safe holiday.
Thank you so much.
We start our new segment today with confirmation by North Korea of its latest displays of military might this week, which included the test firing of cruise missiles and that of surface-to-surface missiles. Our defense correspondent Peo Eun-ji has more.
North Korea confirmed Friday that the missiles it fired the day before were surface-to-surface tactical guided missiles. Surface-to-surface missiles are designed to be launched from the ground or the sea to hit targets on land or at sea. The regime's state-run media KCNA said the 2 missiles successfully hit an island target, which proved the power of their warheads. It added that it will keep on developing powerful warheads capable of performing combat functions and missions. Photos released by KCNA show that the missiles appear to be the North Korean version of Russia's Iskander, KN-23. The photos also show that they were fired from a transporter erector launcher, which are vehicles used to carry, elevate, and then launch missiles. On Thursday, the South Korean military said it detected 2 suspected ballistic missiles fired toward the East Sea from North Korea's Hamhung area. The military said the missiles traveled 190 kilometers at an altitude of 20 kilometers. This was the 6th launch by the North this month, coming just 2 days after it fired 2 cruise missiles on Tuesday. The KCNA also reported that what was launched on Tuesday were long-range cruise missiles, 3 days after it fired them. The state media said the missiles flew for about 2.5 hours before precisely hitting an island target 1,800 kilometers away. It added that the combat performance of this type of missile would boost the country's war deterrence. Earlier on Tuesday, South Korean military officials had said that the North appeared to have fired 2 cruise missiles from an inland area. By reporting on the firing of 2 different types of missiles launched on different dates appears to be the regime's way of showing its capability to hit targets by displaying its diverse arsenal. 배은지, Arirang News.
And in related news, the response from the international community has been prompt, with most calling for a diplomatic approach to settle differences. Our Kim Dami reports.
The U.S. State Department says that North Korea's nuclear issue is still top of Washington's agenda, reiterating that diplomacy and dialogue are the most effective means to achieve denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. State Department spokesperson Ned Price noted on Thursday that the U.S. has no hostility toward the North and is open for dialogue whenever and wherever. The Pentagon also made clear the same day that Washington is equally focused on dealing with the threat posed by the North as it is with all other major security issues. The UN has once again expressed a deep concern over North Korea's continued missile activities. Its spokesperson Stefan Dujarric said during a briefing on Thursday that diplomatic dialogue should get back on track, aimed at complete and verifiable denuclearization of the regime. Germany's foreign ministry also condemned Thursday's missile launch by the North, pointing out such activities clearly violate UN Security Council resolutions. The European Union repeatedly called on Pyongyang to halt missile launches that threaten regional peace and security and go against international efforts to resume dialogue. But China maintained its long usual stance that all parties should speak and act with caution, maintain moving in the direction of dialogue and consultation, and jointly promote the political resolution of the Korean Peninsula issue. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
Back in North Korea, Kim Jong-un was recently at a weapons factory and praised efforts there aimed at advancing the regime's military strength. Our Yoon Jung-min has more.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has reportedly visited a munitions factory which produces key weapon systems, signaling a stronger emphasis on the regime's military capabilities. The Korean Central News Agency reported the news on Friday. Kim was accompanied by his sister Kim Yo-jong, Party Secretary Cho Yong-won, and other officials in charge of weapons development. Kim reportedly stressed the importance of modernizing the armed forces and carrying out defense development strategies, as well as his determination for powerful, state-of-the-art weapons. Officials at the factory reportedly praised Kim for, quote, crushing the challenges by U.S. imperialists and their followers, evidently aiming a message toward the U.S. Kim Jong-un last visited a munitions factory in 2019. The visit comes amid heightened tensions on the Korean Peninsula following a series of missile tests by North Korea this month, while the U.S. is seeking to bolster sanctions on the regime. Last week, the North signaled it would reconsider its moratorium on nuclear and ICBM tests, which are often considered as a so-called U.S. red line. Pyongyang announced suspending nuclear and ICBM tests in 2018 to show preemptive goodwill, but the regime says the U.S. continues to have hostile policies toward them. While the U.S. bolsters sanctions, it calls for dialogue and diplomacy. Experts see the prospects for a resumption of talks between Pyongyang and Washington less likely for the time being, considering the current confrontation. Some also point out that North Korea isn't a high priority for the U.S. right now, which makes dialogue more difficult. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Here in South Korea, industrial output jumped to its highest in more than a decade last year on the back of several factors, including exports. Min Soo-kyun reports.
South Korea's overall industrial production last year saw its biggest jump in 11 years. According to Statistics Korea on Friday, industrial output increased 4.8% in 2021, bouncing back from a 1.2% fall in 2020. It marks the largest growth since 2010. The agency attributed some of the rise to the base effect following the previous year's fall, but stressed that the growth was largely driven by the economic recovery as well as strong exports. By sector, output in mining and manufacturing rose 6.9% last year on the back of semiconductor production, while services gained 4.3%. In particular, in-person services like restaurants and accommodation, wholesale and retail saw positive growth despite the pandemic. And so did transport and warehousing, as well as finance and insurance. Retail sales, a barometer for private consumption, also bounced back to see the largest increase since 2010. Consumer demand was up 5.5% last year, led by sales of clothing, cosmetics, and cars. And facility investment also surged 9% on year. It's the first time in 4 years that the nation's industrial output, consumption, and investment have all seen annual growth. Finance Minister Hong Nam-gi touted the results, saying the economy has proved to be strong even when in crisis. However, while acknowledging potential risks to the economy, Hong vowed to closely monitor the situation and proactively deal with growing internal and external uncertainties. Min Suk-hyun, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the U.S. economy, for its part, marked its strongest year of growth in about 4 decades. In last year, that is. President Joe Biden welcomed the pace of expansion, which reportedly surpassed that of China for the first time in 2 decades. Kim Yo-san has details.
In 2021, the U.S. economy grew at its fastest rate in 37 years. According to a report published by the Commerce Department on Thursday, U.S. GDP, the total output of all goods and services, jumped 5.7%. That's the biggest increase since 1984, when the figure exceeded 7%. The country's economy recorded a 6.9% annual growth rate in the fourth quarter, well above the 5.5% predicted by most economists. Since July 2020, when the U.S. experienced the peak of the first COVID-19 wave, the country's economy has grown for 6 consecutive quarters. This even included a 33% expansion in the third quarter of that year. President Biden praised the country's growth. In a statement, he said that during his first year in office, the American economy not only grew at its fastest pace in nearly 4 decades, but also recorded its largest job growth in history. He added that for the first time in 2 decades, the U.S. economy grew faster than China's. He then urged U.S. lawmakers to swiftly pass his administration's Build Back Better Act, which entails a $1.75 trillion investment in social programs and climate policy. President Biden said this could contribute to sustaining growth momentum. Kim Yo-san, Arirang News.
It's Friday and time for our focus on one particular country and its campaign against COVID-19 and more. Now this week we turn to New Zealand, where Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has cancelled her wedding amid her government's efforts to stem the spread of Omicron. For more on the situation there, I have Professor Michael Baker at the University of Otago, who is also a member of the Ministry of Health's COVID-19 Technical Advisory Group. Professor Baker, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Yes, well, greetings from New Zealand.
Right, Professor, let's begin then with the Omicron situation over in New Zealand, which appears to be in its early stages compared, of course, to the situation in other countries.
Yes, well, look, New Zealand's had a sequence of responses to COVID-19. We had an elimination approach for 18 months. Then from August last year, we had ongoing Delta variant transmission, but at low levels, and that's been suppressed very well. But as of just 6 days ago, we've now got Omicron circulating in New Zealand, so we obviously need to adapt to that. But the net effect so far is we've had around 16,000 cases and 52 deaths in the last 2 years from COVID-19.
Right, and Professor Baker, your daily infection rates still hover below 100 cases per day, right?
Yeah, well, look, we were down to 25 cases a day. That was Delta variant. But just as of today, we're back over 100, and most of them will be Omicron cases. Right. So we're expecting the numbers to rise very dramatically into the thousands over the next 2 to 3 months.
Right, which is why New Zealand currently is under a red alert in line with its COVID-19 traffic light setting, I understand. Could you tell us a bit about this alert arrangement?
Sure. I mean, that, as the name suggests, that's a 3-tier system with red, orange, and green. And we've never been out of in the green zone at all, and the whole country's moved straight to the red zone.
Right. Professor Baker, speaking to local media there, you claim New Zealand needs to close its borders to high-risk countries to perhaps delay community transmissions. Could you tell us a bit more about your thoughts on this?
Well, at the moment, we're still managing our borders quite tightly, but we will actually change that approach once we have widespread Omicron transmission in New Zealand. That is the approach or the intervention that has kept us safe for 2 years. But it does come at a big price because a lot of people want to move across the borders and are currently restricted. So this is one of the reasons for relaxing these controls shortly.
Professor Baker, now, do share with us a bit about New Zealand's COVID-19 vaccination campaign and its role perhaps in keeping the pandemic at bay thus far.
Well, these current approaches work very efficiently at minimising the numbers in New Zealand. With the new approach, of course, the red light restrictions do limit gathering sizes, but the main thing they do is introduce a vaccine, indoor vaccine mandate. So if you want to be indoors with other people, you have to be fully vaccinated. So the vaccine passed for that. And also restrictions on gathering size.
And Professor Baker, what has been the response, or the public response that is, to vaccinations in general over in New Zealand?
People have been very positive to vaccination. We've got around 90% of the population is now vaccinated. And we're rolling out boosters, which are around 25% at this point. And also the vaccination of children down to 5 years of age.
Right, and speaking about booster shots, Professor Baker, what are your thoughts on calls for additional vaccine shots, like a fourth dose or a second booster?
Well, I think we accept that, well, I should say the priority at the moment is to vaccinate or roll out boosters to the whole population. But in the future, it may be that that COVID-19 will behave like influenza, and we may need an annual booster shot, but we're certainly not planning on a fourth dose at the moment.
Right, and talking about COVID-19 behaving like the influenza, how do you respond, Professor Baker, to talk about Omicron perhaps slowly ushering in an endemic phase of COVID-19?
A lot depends on how we define endemic disease, because some people define it as no longer a problem. But many endemic diseases actually are still quite serious. And influenza, for example, is still responsible for 1 to 2% of deaths in many high-income countries. And we obviously want to minimise that. And in part, diseases like smallpox were endemic. So a lot does come down to how we define that, what endemic means. It certainly, it won't be endemic. Hopefully after the Omicron variant is contained around the world, but it will still be a problem that needs to be managed.
Right, and going back to Omicron, Professor Baker, Omicron has exhausted testing capacity of countries that are dealing with it. What can you tell us about the testing capacity of New Zealand?
Well, like many countries, we've relied very much on PCR testing and have built up a great capacity to do that. But the problem is that when Omicron becomes very intense, that PCR capacity won't be sufficient. So we will really need to switch to rapid antigen tests. They have not been used very much in New Zealand to date, partly because of the elimination approach. We've relied almost entirely on high-quality PCR testing.
Right, which has been the case here in South Korea as well. And before you go, Professor Baker, do tell us a bit about efforts by New Zealand to offer aid, that is, to Tonga as the latter continues to grapple with the aftermath of an underwater volcanic eruption.
Yeah, well, one of the challenges is that is not to introduce COVID-19 into these Pacific islands, because many have succeeded with an elimination strategy continually for 2 years now, and Tonga is one of them. So when there are shipments or aid is delivered by air and by sea, they use various approaches to prevent contact with local people, and they talk about a contactless approach for unloading ships and aircraft. And of course, all the crews are fully vaccinated and boosted and so on, but it is a risk, and we have seen transmission on Australian ships recently. So I think everyone's very conscious of preventing introduction of the virus.
Right, of course. Right then, Professor Baker, thank you very much for your thoughts and your time.
Great to talk. Thank you.
Korea's COVID-19 strategy is looking ahead to a new test as it seeks to keep Omicron under control amid a predicted uptick in public activity to mark the extended Lunar New Year holiday. For more, I have Dr. Kim Taek from Institute Pasteur Korea. Welcome back, Dr. Kim.
Good afternoon.
I also have Dr. Alice Hyung-Dan at Miss Mary Women's Hospital live on the line. Dr. Dan, it's good to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
Right, Dr. Kim, Korea's daily tally has been hovering above 10,000 for 3 straight days, but the number of patients in critical condition remains on the 300 level. When do you suppose that number will perhaps surge to better reflect the number of escalating cases here?
Well, to answer that question, we need to understand the sort of just a disease course of this COVID-19. So a typical disease course is that once we just expose the virus actually enter mostly just the lung, and the baby, or in the case of Omicron, is upper respiratory tract, and then starts some replication. So then at one time, when the viral load increases at some point, then we can just start to feel some symptoms. So this period between the exposure and the symptoms onset is some incubation period. This incubation period is, formerly for the variants is typically the 4 to 5 days, but now some reports said maybe Omicron, maybe it is getting just shorter. And then after that, that we feel symptoms, and then there's some typical course of the first phase of the disease is viral replication phase, which is we can actually treat with, we can actually deal with some monoclonal antibodies or like some Paxlovid oral just antiviral drugs. And then later, if the disease does not resolve, then the infected person can go to some moderate or just a severe COVID-19. So it does actually takes time, depending on the some person. Maybe it can go up to like a couple of weeks, maybe 1 week or like a couple of weeks.
Right, I see. Dr. Dan, new U.S. data shows Omicron fatalities have surpassed those recorded during Delta's peak. Having said that, do you see a similar scenario perhaps unfolding here in Korea?
Well, that is my biggest concern right now. And the reason why I say this is because already we're seeing the number of cases who are age 16 older increase. That inflection point seems to have been January 18th. That's when we stopped seeing that decrease in cases that were older, in that older population group. And now we are seeing more and more cases who are age 16 older. Yesterday, we had more than 1,100 of these cases. We're also seeing an increase in hospital admissions. Never before in the history of the pandemic in Korea did we have a single day hospital admission load greater than 1,000. Yet yesterday, we had 1,017 new hospital admissions due to COVID-19. Still, we have more than 6 million people in our country who have not even started their first shot of COVID-19 vaccines. And the population third dose booster rate is just slightly over 50%. So I think what we really need to do is stay focused, coordinate our efforts, and really work as a team to try to identify our high-risk patients early on within that window of opportunity to get them treated with remdesivir or with Paxlovid. And that's really the only way that we can avoid that similar fate of high deaths and hospitalizations due to the Omicron surge.
Right. And staying with findings in the U.S. and more, Dr. Kim, research also shows Omicron now accounts for 99.9% of all COVID-19 infections over in the U.S. Does this reality mean that the Delta variant has been eradicated?
Well, I can't tell for sure, but at this moment, the Omicron seems to be just more fit than the Delta. And when we actually talk about some viral fitness, we actually just we actually consider two different aspects. One of the things is the whether this new virus or a certain virus is more has a more advantage in terms of virus replication. And the other aspect is whether this is in terms of just host aspect, maybe just host immune response. It's how just the host immune response affects some viral replication. So they are actually just we actually weighing two different aspects. And then there was recently there was a very interesting report from from Denmark. And then the study actually compares the Delta infection and the Omicron infection, and that actually addressed both just virus replication and also some any immune responses. And very interestingly, the Omicron, well, this is basically just to address the transmissibility of the Omicron. The answer to the question is that basically it's a viral load from the two different patients, whether it is Delta and Omicron, very similar. The viral load from the patient was very similar, but then one of the major difference from these two different viruses, the immune evasiveness. So what we know so far about the Omicron compared to other prior variants is that this Omicron has a lot of just mutation, like some over 30 of a mutation on the spike protein, and that this spike protein is just a major determinant, actually the major target of our vaccine that we actually using right now. So if there are more mutation, and the chances are the antibody that were actually generated by our prior vaccine somehow do not help very much. Although our T cell response is pretty good. So at this moment, this immune evasiveness is a major sort of advantage that Omicron variant has compared to the Delta variant right now.
Right, I see. And moving forward, Dr. Tan, I understand that relevant information is evolving, but what can you share with us about the so-called stealth Omicron that has been detected in quite a number of countries, including here in Korea, as pointed out by my colleague Yeon earlier on?
Right, so the so-called stealth variant is a subvariant of the Omicron variant. Is called BA.2. And investigators are still looking into the characteristics of this variant. The reason why we call it the stealth variant is not because it's inherently more transmissible, but because it lacks the deletion at a specific location of the gene in the spike protein, so location 6970. And this deletion caused what was known as a S gene target failure on PCR tests, and it was used as a proxy for detecting Omicron cases when the background number of cases of Delta was high. And so what this means is epidemiologically, we will not be able to, in some cases, differentiate between Delta and Omicron if the Omicron subvariant is this BA2 subvariant. However, I think what we should use right now in terms of our basis for understanding is that for now, it does not seem to be more transmissible. It does not seem to evade our diagnostics. It does not seem to cause more severe disease. So I think there's no reason to panic. It's just a subvariant that was detected. And if we remember back to our Delta wave, very early on, we had one subvariant of the Delta variant that people were very concerned it might become dominant, but that just didn't seem to be the case. And that might be what happens eventually to this so-called stealth variant.
Right, which is why you're saying we don't have to panic right now then. Dr. Kim, a study of British adults published in The Lancet last autumn actually found that fully vaccinated COVID-19 patients are 49% less likely to suffer from long COVID. What more can you tell us about this?
Well, first of all, just in case, there are some people who don't understand the long COVID. I have to actually explain just what the long COVID means, and that there are some certain people even after just a recovery after acute COVID-19, there are people who are actually suffering from some post-acute COVID-19 sequelae. So this is typically the symptoms after the 4 weeks after the symptom onset. So the manifestation of these symptoms are very diverse. It's like some dozens of the symptoms symptoms, including like chronic fatigue, and then some joint pain, and then like a hair loss, and then the headache, and then brain fog, which is actually just cognitive disturbances. There are a lot of just the symptoms, and that's why actually even just now US NIH actually now start to just invest a lot of just money to just investigate this long COVID and then potential any therapeutics to deal with the symptoms. And then the vaccine actually seems to pretty just work against this long COVID. And this is not a new information. I mean, even just several months ago, we actually just aware of the effect of this vaccine against this long COVID. And then when we actually just finished some vaccination schedule, then we after infected with some COVID-19 and the recovery, the chances of just experiencing long COVID is very, very low. And then very interesting thing is even after infection, I mean, without just the vaccination, we infected, and then after infected, we got just the vaccine. Then also that actually somehow very just a positive effect, just to reduce the chance of just the long COVID. So anyway, the vaccination seems to be a very good just strategy to deal with the long COVID and yeah, so that's the key element. But in terms of some mechanical correlation that how long long COVID can be reduced by vaccination, we do not know the answer. But we actually have some correlation with the vaccination and the reduction of the some long COVID. That's all we know so far.
Right, so for those who are suffering from long COVID, getting a vaccine after infection has also served to ease their long COVID symptoms.
Exactly, yeah, but as soon as possible.
Okay, I see. Dr. Tan, local findings point to discrepancies in the level of protection generated by different vaccines. For instance, a person who had, let's say, 3 shots of Pfizer appeared to have made more antibodies than a person who received 2 shots of AstraZeneca, followed by a 3rd shot of Pfizer. What are the implications of such findings?
Well, 16.5% of all new COVID infections during the 2nd week of January were actually 3rd dose booster breakthrough infections. And so what we need to do is investigate very thoroughly the vaccination history of all of these 3rd dose booster breakthrough cases and follow them very carefully through their course of illness. I think we need to have a plan in place just in case it looks like a 3rd dose of Pfizer after either 1 or 2 doses of AstraZeneca causes decreased protection against severe disease due to the Omicron variant. We need to remember that more than 11 million people in our country received either 1 or 2 doses of AstraZeneca, and many of these AstraZeneca vaccine recipients are healthcare workers. And so we need to have a plan in place. Perhaps a 4th booster using Moderna might add a level of protection. Now, some reassuring news from the UK is that at 10 weeks after a 3rd dose booster, even though vaccine effectiveness against symptomatic disease due to Omicron went down to 45 to 50%, vaccine effectiveness against hospitalization due to Omicron at that 2.5-month time point remained quite high at 83%. So that is one bit of good news, but I think we do need to look very carefully as to what sort of clinical consequences decreased antibody levels have in people who received a 3rd dose of Pfizer after 1 or 2 doses of AstraZeneca.
Right, so more research is necessary at this moment as well. Dr. Kim, a great number of people will be offered the rapid antigen testing here in the country as part of efforts to boost our testing capacity. Having said that, do tell us a bit about the proper use of these rapid antigen tests.
Well, actually, recently there has been just a little bit of a debate on the whether to use the some PCR method and then some rapid antigen test. And first of all, I think I have to just explain just a little bit about the PCR test and then the rapid antigen test. Many people, I mean, this is a kind of known fact. The PCR test is obviously very, very sensitive because basically the PCR test is actually detecting some RNA fragments. This is some genetic material of the coronavirus, but not we actually detect just in itself. We actually amplifying these RNA fragments. exponential just amplification. So that's why this test is very, very sensitive. But for the rapid antigen test, there might be some way to just amplifying the signals, but the amplification cannot be compared to the PCR test. So in terms of sensitivity issues, RT-PCR is the much better. But sometimes this also detecting some viral just genetic material, even from sort of just dead viruses. So that's why we are saying just this is oversensitive. So one of the differences there for the PCR test, it takes time. Like at least maybe the 2 to 3 hours after collecting the samples, so that if there are too many just the samples, then it'll just take time, like maybe more than like maybe one day or 2 days. So that's why maybe government now just trying to just replace the PCR-based test with the some rapid antigen test. In the case of rapid antigen test, this is just maybe just 15 minutes. That should be fine. And then once the samples are collected, we can actually just tell just whether this person, at least, I mean, although sensitivity is low, we can tell roughly that the person is positive or just not. And then one of the some precautions with using this rapid antigen test is just sample collecting. Because many people will just try to use this test kit by themselves without the help from any just medical expert. So the sampling issues, are just a key point. And in Korea now we are using this test kits from the 3 different companies. And then as far as I know, the sampling procedure is almost identical from among those companies. And then basically we are actually collecting the samples from the nasal cavity, probably 1.5 centimeters deep, and then just swab the nasal cavity, and then just put some in buffer in the test tubes. So except for the sampling issues, I think others are pretty much just straightforward. But the critical the step that makes some error is that there's a sampling issues. So now in Korea we are not there's no any certain guidelines, but in some other countries actually recommended maybe blowing nose before just collecting samples. So that might be actually considered as well.
Right, I see. And Dr. Dan, come February 6, Korea's current COVID-19 prevention guidelines will end, and authorities have hinted at the likelihood of an extension. When do you suppose will it be necessary for authorities here to strengthen their containment measures?
That's a really good question, and I don't think this has been adequately addressed. And in my opinion, this is one part of our response that could have been improved upon during our most recent Delta wave. One thing that we know about the Omicron surge is that it really is like a tsunami. There is a huge number of patients who are sick all of a sudden within a short period of time. And so the risk of overwhelming regional healthcare systems is very high. So in my opinion, if hospital or ICU occupancy hits 50% in any region of our country, I think we should seriously consider strengthening our social distancing restrictions, because what we need is early forecasting and acting proactively against this surge. Otherwise, we could actually make the situation worse by debilitating our healthcare systems because of an overwhelming number of Omicron cases.
Right. And staying with containment efforts, Dr. Kim, what are your thoughts on such measures within perhaps the academic arena as schools look to resume classes soon?
Well, that's tough, because the people who are actually just attending the school, many actually just the schoolers are actually not not eligible for the vaccination as of right now. So most of the restriction is actually basically the same as the before, the physical distancing and then so wearing masks. And then since now we have some rapid antigen tests, one of the additional just measure we can take is that very frequent just a rapid antigen test for these children.
Right. And for the sake of our viewers, Dr. Dan, what can you tell us about the specific symptoms with regard to Omicron?
Well, for Omicron, it seems like there seems to be less loss of taste and smell compared to the Delta variant. And there seems to be more sore throat, fever, cough, and diarrhea associated with the Omicron variant. But I think the important thing, though, is if you have an upper respiratory illness symptom this season, don't try to diagnose yourself at home by, trying to see if you can still smell some flowers or perfume, and then use that as a test, a litmus test to see whether or not you have COVID. The important thing is, even if we are prioritizing our testing, right now we do have the capacity to test 850,000 people per day. So it's worthwhile to go and get tested to make sure that you don't have COVID. Also, if you have symptoms, please self-isolate, because whether it's COVID, the flu, or just a cold, you really don't want to be spreading this to other people. And so you do want to self-isolate until your symptoms have resolved.
Right, of course. Dr. Kim, what has been disclosed thus far about the rates of reinfection and breakthrough infections amid the emergence of Omicron?
Well, we actually heard about some reinfection case just early in the pandemic in probably Hong Kong. And then there are actually two different ways of we can get actually immunity against the virus. One is through the natural infection, and the other is the vaccination. And for this coronaviruses, for these respiratory viruses, to get actually just a protective immunity, just sterilizing immunity is very, very different. And then the one way actually we can attain this is actually we actually develop some mucosal immunity. And then that actually can effectively just block the infection. But then the mucosal immunity is very short-lived, and then also very short-lived, so we can actually expect that this kind of a short-lived the immunity can protect for so long time. So in terms of reinfection for the natural infection cases, once we just infected with the Omicron, and basically at least we can just develop antibodies very specific to the Omicron. So that very short after the Omicron infection, we probably can be just protected by the reinfection with the Omicron. But the antibodies actually just wanes very quickly compared to the T cell responses. So then the reinfection is kind of inevitable, over the long time. And then for the vaccination also, for the vaccines that were actually developed for the original SARS-CoV-2 cannot actually protect infection, although we can protect from the severe diseases. But for the recent booster shot, although antibody is not really specific for the Omicron variant, if the titer, the amount of antibody is so high, then this antibody can actually a little bit just block the infection. But this is actually after very short, only just a short period after the booster shot. So in the end, this antibody wanes, then we can get infected. But the good thing is that we still have a very robust T cell responses, which can actually just prevent the severe disease due to the Omicron.
Right, I see. All right then, Dr. Kim, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts today. Dr. Dan, thank you for joining us live at this hour.
Thank you.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of this week's editions of the Daily Report. Do have a safe and happy Lunar New Year. We'll be back on Thursday next week after the extended holiday. See you then.